Our reading today comes from Lois Van Leer. This is For Pride. They will march, walk, wheel, dance, shimmy and shake, block upon block of undulating color, flesh, banners, signs, clothing, or lack thereof. Hands raised, hands linked, apart, together, singing, shouting, chanting, silent. Joyous, tearful, nervous, proud, afraid, defiant, angry, happy, delirious, tentative, ecstatic, courageous, brave, free. The stereotype, the unrecognizable, the flamboyant, the ordinary, the parent, the child, the runaway, the lost, the lonely, the found. Gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, questioning, non-binary allies. Those who taunt and jeer, their banners of hate 10 feet tall. God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. Burn in hell. The other slogans. Straight but not narrow. I love my gay child. Answering the call of love. One day a year, 1 out of 365, Mardi Gras out of season, festive, bacchanalian, tame, booths, food, shopping. Underneath there is a history, resistance. It was the marginalized of the marginalized, drag queens, transvestites, the butch and the femme, who, unlike Rosa Parks, did not sit down, but in their tired rage stood up, rose up, fought back, holding the police captive in the bars they had come to raid, their weapons, their oppression, their hands, beer bottles. Stonewall, 6 days of riots in New York, June 1969. A year later, a march in Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, LA, San Fran, and now, any weekend in June, anywhere around the world, Pride. Why do we march? For those who are not able, for those who have been murdered, for those who are ravaged by disease, for those who are still beaten, still taunted, still harassed, still victims, still targets. Why do we march? Because some truths ain't self-evident, because all men ain't protected equal, and we love a good party. They will march, walk, wheel, dance, shimmy and shake, block upon block of undulating color, flesh, banners, signs, clothing or lack thereof, hands raised, hands linked, apart, together, singing, shouting, chanting, silent, joyful, tearful, nervous, afraid, proud, defiant, angry, happy, delirious, tentative, ecstatic, courageous, brave, free. June 12th of 2016 was supposed to be a joyfully bittersweet day for me. My teaching pastor and internship congregation in Youngstown, Ohio, were celebrating the end of my internship with me. I had graduated from seminary a few weeks before, and my supervisor was then back from the second part of his sabbatical. We were celebrating the things and ways we all had learned and grown in our time together. I don't recall when I first read the news about the Pulse massacre that morning, but it was before I made the hour and change trek to my internship. At first, it sounded like just another shooting, the kind that we hear about on the regular living in America. Not that made it any less horrifying, but unfortunately, the horror is part of our social narrative. First, it was a shooting at a nightclub. Stories began emerging about the terror of the people who were able to escape, of the people inside making final calls to loved ones. Some of them hid in restrooms. Those who could fled for their lives. Stories began emerging that it was a gay bar, and there were many Latinx folks who were there that night, the numbers of dead rising. Eventually, the news broke that it was Latin night at the bar. Two well-known Latinx, trans, and drag performers were featured on stage that night. Watching my Facebook feed and my queer friends saying, this is us, when will it end? And then later, this club was targeted on this night not only to kill as many people as possible, but to kill brown queer folks specifically. The complexities were so real. This has been the experience of queer people for generations, and the queer and LGBTQIA+ community is not immune from racism. It was the first time I really had a glimpse into what it might be like to have a loved one there, to feel panic and terror. My best friend is Latinx, queer, and disabled. They could have been there that night if they had been in Orlando. Then there were the names being released of those who had died. There was fear that some of them were being outed to their family for the first time, and that some of them had been undocumented. It was at the time of the deadliest mass shooting in modern U.S. history and remains the single deadliest attack on the queer and LGBTQIA+ community in U.S. history. The lines of the queer folks, gay men specifically, lining up to donate blood, knowing that for reasons no one can fathom anymore, reasons that emerged and were instituted during the AIDS epidemic that came into being due to homophobia and not science. They knew they wouldn't be able to participate, but they had to show up. It was their way of having some power, some community, some way to gather and mourn as they had for generations on generations before. A vigil for the day, for the dozens killed that night, made possible by the same ugly homophobia that killed thousands of people as the government mocked those who became infected and eventually died terrible, often lonely deaths. They remembered. They remembered those who came before them, those who lost and gathered, like the San Francisco Gay Men's Chorus, who, at that time, were singing for their lives. From their website, founded in 1978, the AIDS epidemic was ravaging the gay community. Loss, fear, and the desperate need for connection fueled the chorus's creation. These men weren't just gathering to perform, they were building a sanctuary where their voices, in all their joy, vulnerability, and determination, could resonate freely. The very act of openly proclaiming their identities at that specific moment in history was revolutionary. It was a period of immense darkness, they continue. The AIDS epidemic unleashed a wave of devastation, fueling widespread stigma and leaving countless individuals consumed by grief and fear. Yet even amidst this crisis, a powerful act of defiance and hope took shape. The act of these men joining voices and openly declaring themselves as gay was itself a radical act. They weren't simply seeking an artistic endeavor, they were claiming space. The chorus became a refuge where they could process their shared trauma, celebrate their identities, and quite literally sing their joy, even in the face of immense pain. That was long before the queer and LGBTQIA+ community felt more confident being in public, before some had the privileges bestowed by marriage equality and broader social acceptance. It has only been more recently that they started to think that those private, underground communities that had sustained them for so long might no longer be necessary. That night in 2016 impacted me deeply, impacted my understanding of gay and queer culture and history in a new way, gave me more insight into the stories of so many people I love. For example, if you look at the pictures that were available of those who were killed, many of them are selfies. It was the first mass event where selfies were the best and most candid pictures available for victims. It was probably the first time that people were able to name and honor that, at least for some of them. Selfies were when they could feel most completely themselves. There's a post I go back to every year from June 14th of 2016, written by, the profile name is Danny Burrow, a brown, presumably Latinx queer person, to their siblings and kin. They write, "I'm looking at the pictures of the dead and noticing how many of the photos are selfies. When reporters scroll through the victims' Facebook profiles and choose the truest and most beautiful likenesses, they choose selfies. I'm thinking about how images of us are at the most powerful and authentic and vulnerable and strong and perfect when we are in control of them. I'm thinking about how the most prevalent images of queer and Latino people in the media, how they are monstrous or invisible, caricatures or irrelevant. I'm thinking about how much more rich and beautiful my world is when my newsfeed is full of your own photos of your own selves. I'm thinking, when someone shows you who they are, believe them. I'm thinking about Omar Mateen's selfies and his NYPD souvenirs. I'm thinking about how to take control of our own images of our own selves. I'm thinking how to render ourselves visible, how needed that is, and how dangerous to our souls and hearts and our tiny, fragile bodies. How vulnerable, how gorgeous, how brave." They continue, "Your body is radical. Your face is revolutionary. Your selfies are going to save the ever-loving world." I will note they did not say ever-loving, but I can't say what they wrote from the pulpit. And I remember how beautiful they were. So many young people, so many of the pictures released were the best of them, taken when they were joyful and happy, coy or playful, full of life, proud and whole. The way they demanded the world see them exactly as they were, no more, no less. My own words from June 15th of 2016. "I understand the impulse that we are all human. We are. And their blackness and brownness and queerness matters. It mattered to their lives and their deaths. It matters to the living. If we believe their lives and loves mattered, and they did, we must not accept anything less than honoring their wholeness in death. And we must fight and love and dance like hell for the living, because this too matters." To help gain a little more understanding and perspective on Black and brown queerness, I read a memoir called "Punch Me Up to the Gods" by Brian Broom. Broom was selected as a featured speaker at the 2023 General Assembly. Throughout the memoir, Broom weaves contemporary vignettes with stories from his past. He grew up in a rural area to the near northwest of my teaching congregation in eastern Ohio. And although gender, sexuality, and race are social constructs, they are social constructs that deeply impact people's lived experiences. Broom talks about how his gayness, his queerness, impacted his already challenging experiences as a Black male, and how his Blackness impacted his already challenging experiences as a gay male. He writes, "My father back then believed in beating Black boys the way Black boys are supposed to be beaten. For our own good, he would say. Meant to toughen us up for a world where white people feed off our pain and to teach us that we cannot give them the satisfaction. Any Black boy who did not signify how manly he was at all times deserved to be punched back up to God to be remade, reshaped. Sometimes I would look into his face after my beating and I would feel the apology radiating off him. But he would never apologize because he wanted to teach me that the world wouldn't." The intersection of these identities is deeply complex, no less so for a boy growing up in the 1970s and 80s in both a rural and suddenly far poorer area with the sudden closure of steel mills. To appreciate the need for sanctuaries exclusive to queer folks, his memoir will help give insight. Their lives were pulsing that night and in the nightclub as they danced and celebrated what became a later horrid night. People of different ages and relationships. A mother was there with her son. Siblings were there together. Partners and friends, of course, as well. Men, women, and people of other genders, gay, straight, bi, or pan. Mostly black or brown, or at least the dead were. On vacation, celebrating birthdays and other events, some showing their skills as dancers, so much joy in that building, a safe place where they could all be free. It was a sanctuary from a harsh world where they were not fully accepted. Students, executives, hairstylists, dancers, medical professionals, people came from all different backgrounds. That's one of the reasons Pulse was so popular as a nightclub. It was an inclusive space where all were welcome. We live in a state where the 2 U.S. senators in 2022 authored a resolution to honor the victims of the Pulse massacre and who said, quote, "We vow to always stand up and fight against evil and hatred in this world." But the state has now authored and passed into laws bills that censor classroom discussions about sexual orientation or gender identity until 8th grade. Another that threatens the health and well-being of trans children by criminalizing healthcare providers who provide medically safe gender-affirming care. Another that prohibits gender-inclusive restrooms and changing facilities in government buildings and correctional institutions. Another that dramatically restricts trans adults' ability to receive gender-affirming care. And another that grants, quote, "courts of this state temporary emergency jurisdiction over a child present in this state if the child has been subjected to or is threatened with being subjected to sex reassignment prescriptions or procedures." That is to say, if a family comes to Florida to say, go to Disney, if the parent that brought them has a trans child who they don't want receiving gender-affirming care, that child can be taken into the custody of the state, at least temporarily. And let's not forget the support for legislation that prohibits children from attending certain events that may be interpreted to include drag shows or possibly even pride events. Do we live in a state that honors the lives of those who were hunted and killed that night? Because based on Florida's legislation, we absolutely do not. And hate of queer folks is spreading quickly. I've been part of a network, actually 2, that has worked to get trans, non-binary, and other queer individuals and families out of Florida to safer places, or to support them in getting the care they need if they choose to or need to remain here. Requests for a long time have been coming in daily. It sure doesn't sound like we live in a state that honors its history or its people. But we don't need the state to honor those who died and the many who still live and fight for their lives daily. We never have. This space is a sanctuary. May we make it a space safe for everyone. This faith is a sanctuary. We believe every person has the right to live their lives in fullness and in love, to everything possible. May we honor the lives lost and remember them by dancing fully and often and by being ourselves. And may those of us who have the ability to do so continue to advocate for the freedom and justice for all, that we may all be able to dance without fear ever again, because joy is resistance too. Our closing hymn is Everything Possible. The other congregation found it tricky, so it's a gentle song, kind of a lullaby. Think John Denver as you're singing it. It's a really lovely piece, and I hope that you enjoy it as much as I do. It was written by a UU minister who is also a musician.